Hey everybody, welcome back to Leosophy. This is not like an official part of the occult series. It's more like a little addendum. It's just something that occurred to me and I thought I would make a short video about because I've noticed a pattern. And it all started with a question, which is, well, how do we know what is sacred and what is profane? Like, why are some things sacred? And my mind immediately went to sacred cows. I started thinking about sacred cows and why in the Indo-Aryan tradition that there's always primordial cows and that cows are revered until they're not. But if you look at that, if you look at Hinduism, Zoroastrianism, Slavic paganism, uh, Germanic and Norse paganism. I don't think there's any in Hellenic paganism, but you could argue that the goat that gave off ambrosia could be sort of a substitute for that. But there's primordial cows, and I started thinking like, well, why would they be regarded as sacred? And I think this is speculative on my part. These are just literally the reason why I'm making this video. These are just random thoughts that sort of started to take form into something a little more concrete. And I'd love you guys' opinion on this. But I've noticed that things that tend to be sacred, that tend to have like a very important place in different religious institutions. I don't really like that word, but you know what I mean. They tend to be important because they fill three roles. And what I mean is they fill a role as a pragmatic, materialistic concept. And then they fulfill a role as a symbolic, but rather base and mundane concept. And then lastly, they fulfill a role purely as a spiritual concept. And so, thinking about cows. So, pragmatically, you live in an area like the steppes of where Eurasia, India, and Europe kind of meet. I said Eurasia, I mean Asia, India, and Europe kind of meet. And it's not the most fertile land in the world. It's a little difficult to live a hunter gatherer lifestyle in that area. And as a result, a cow becomes extremely useful because they make far more milk than they need to raise their young. The milk itself can then be altered in various ways, mostly through fermentation, in order to make a variety of nutritious foods. And then the dung of the animal can be used to make fuel, and then the animal's physical labor itself, either its own or the more likely a male offspring of it, an ox in other words, can be used to till and irrigate land, thus getting even more vital nutrition. So a cow is a very useful thing, is where I'm going. Same way with yaks in Tibet. So that's the pragmatic idea. It's something that's extremely useful, and you value that which is useful. And if you value something enough on a cultural level, it can become sacred. We see this even with pop culture, and things that like will unite a town or a state. They'll all gather around under something that they happen to all mutually enjoy, like a food or a particular place of business that just sort of starts to represent that area. Well, a cow could be regarded in that respect. So that's the most base materialistic view. But then it gets more interesting when you start looking at it from what I would call a spiritually mundane view, which sounds negative, but I just mean something that bridges between a religious idea and a pragmatic idea. And we can see this in pretty much every culture, the idea of generative force being important and sacred. In other words, the divine masculine and the divine feminine. You see this in literally every belief structure. And, it makes sense. People plant seeds in the ground, the earth mother and the sky father provides sunlight and rain that causes those plants to grow. And that can be applied to animals, that can be applied to people. Those masculine and feminine concepts are everywhere. And generative concepts are everywhere. Well, a cow is a very feminine animal. It's one of the most maternal animals out there. Its female reproductive organs are really big. It's the same reason why bull worship for its masculinity in the Hellenic areas by the Etruscans and the Greeks and the Romans is so common. A bull is a hyper-masculine animal, and a cow is a hyper-feminine animal. So you've got those concepts, this very maternal nature, even towards people that raise them. I used to raise dairy cows, and it's astonishing how you can kind of tell just from their overall mannerisms that they kind of treat the people who take care of them almost in a way like they're their offspring. It's a little weird. A dog tends to think that a person is their parent on some level, and cats definitely do. We've done that through just looking at their brains. It appears, and I think that maybe some neurological tests to confirm this would be interesting. It appears to me that a lot of cows seem to view humans as their offspring. It's a weird thing, and that's really conjecture and purely based on anecdotal evidence. But there's some interesting things regarding that, at least from my perspective. But that's not even where I was going with that. I kind of went off on a tangent. More importantly, cows produce copious amounts of milk. That's why they're pragmatically useful. But if you look at, for example, in Hinduism, Shiva Lingam, which is a phallic symbol, is just constantly being bathed, I guess you could say, in milk. Now, the sexual connotations of that are pretty obvious. You've got milk being poured over a phallic object. It's kind of obvious from that perspective that milk is seen as a feminine analog to sperm. I know that sounds like I'm being like Freudian, or I'm just trying to reduce everything to orifices like certain other groups, certain degenerate groups, as well as a few people who I agree with on a lot of things, but then they will reduce everything down to placentas and holes and stuff. But it goes further than that. I'm not reducing it. I'm just pointing out the most basic level that milk, if you think about it, it doesn't produce life the way, seed, to use a more biblical connotation, does, but it nourishes life, and it's also the same rough color. And so having that association, I mean, again, imagine a pre-science, a pre-industrial, sometimes a pre-agricultural even society, and again, you're exploring the world and trying to figure out how things work, and you know that if you put seeds in the ground, that the sun from the sky will nourish the earth that the seeds grow in, and they become crops. And likewise, if an animal, a male animal that you're trying to produce more of, puts seeds in a female animal, then you'll produce more animals. And then likewise, for human beings to be fruitful and multiply, the males plant a seed in the female. Again, I'm talking about all this from a pre-germ theory, pre-genetic, any written knowledge kind of perspective. And it's hard to do. It's hard to try to empathize with that perspective, given how far we are removed from it. But bearing that in mind, it's like, well, here's an animal that's nourishing an entire human family with a substance that has generative connotations, even though it itself is not a generative substance. I can see that leading to an association of that very compound, cow's milk, as a sacred thing. So now we have this more baseline view where you've got the mundane component, a nourishing, nutritious thing that keeps your family alive, and now we also have a slightly more spiritual view of it, because now it has generative properties. Not the same way that reproductive compounds have generative properties, but generative properties nonetheless. So that's sort of the bridge. That's the second level. And then on the third level, we have speculation of, well, who am I? Where did I come from? What is my purpose? And again, if you look at most belief structures that originated in Europe and the Uralic region in India, there's this notion of a primordial cow being the beginning of these things. So we go all the way back to that divine feminine symbolism where a cow is what I call a hyper feminine animal. and a bull is a hyper masculine animal. And we see that even with modern cartoons. 20th century animators, they couldn't just show, you know, the genitals of these animals to showcase what they were. In fact, Annabelle the cow, or Mirabelle the cow, had udders and wore like a hoop skirt, and people lost their minds over that. Like, Disney got so many phone calls and letters over that you would not believe. So that's actually why they put horns on a bull, and that's why a lot of, like, city folk genuinely seem to think that, like, the difference between a cow and a bull is that bulls have horns, and that's not the case at all. Because a horn is a phallic symbol, and that's how they used that in that animation to designate that. So in other words, you're dealing with hyper feminine and hyper masculine animals, and that leads to the just a rough translation. I was talking about sympathetic magic. That's why this sort of follows it, where one thing stands in for another. Well, a bull can stand in, being a hyper masculine animal, as a skyfather, and a cow, being a hyper feminine animal, is a stand-in for an earth mother. And a cow in particular, because of that milk, there's something kind of obvious and qualitative that binds the two together, symbolically, of hypermasculinity and hyperfemininity. So that is why I think a lot of things that we see throughout cultures tend to be sacred, or tend to be elevated just above what we would regard as profane, is because they resonate with us on those three levels. They resonate with us because, one, they're pragmatic. Because if people don't do things that are pragmatic, eventually they go extinct. That's just, the nature of things. If there was a tribe somewhere that gouged their eyes out because of their religion, eventually that tribe's just going to get out competed by people who have eyes, right? So it has to be beneficial on a pragmatic level. But then it also has to resonate psychologically on a level that mirrors the things that we value, and masculinity and femininity, and the union of the two in tandem with this notion of a sky father and an earth mother, and especially in union with just the natural state of being, that if you have plants that are fruitful and multiply, then you're going to be well fed. And if you have livestock that are fruitful and multiply, you're going to be well fed. And if you yourself are fruitful and multiply, you're going to have a legacy. So that's the spiritual but simultaneously pragmatic second step. And then lastly, it has to also mirror something in your actual theology. And so I think that the reason why cows are prevalent throughout those cultures is because they have all three of those attributes. So that's just, again, this isn't something I've put a tremendous amount of thought in. It's just one of those things that bubbled up and I felt compelled to make a video about. So I think the next occultism is going to be the last one, but this one's not really. I don't think I'll put 5 or 6 next to it. This is just more of a, I don't know, intermezzo kind of vid. But yeah, want to hear your opinions on that though. Like, share, subscribe, keep asking questions. Bye.